Unaware his pregnant ex-wife is now married to a billionaire, Richard Blackwell sat in his Bentley 50 yards away, laughing with his mistress Vanessa about the muddy water they just splashed all over Emma, when a convoy of black Range Rovers with government plates pulled up to the street corner where his ex-wife stood, dripping and shaking. Richard's laughter died in his throat as he watched security personnel form a protective barrier around the woman he just called barren and worthless, watched a man in an expensive suit step out and wrap a coat around Emma's trembling shoulders, watched that same man's face transform from concern to murderous rage as Emma told him everything. "Wait," Richard whispered, his hands starting to shake on the steering wheel. Is that Alexander Sterling?" Vanessa's face went white. "Oh my God, Richard, that's the Alexander Sterling, the billionaire's son. What did you just do?" But Richard couldn't answer because Alexander Sterling was walking directly toward their Bentley, his eyes locked on Richard like a predator who just found his prey. And in that moment, Richard Blackwell realized with absolute horror that the poor, desperate woman he just humiliated in front of cameras wasn't struggling at all. She was married to the man who controlled every contract, keeping his 47-pound million empire alive. What happened in the next 72 hours didn't just shock Richard and his mistress, it destroyed them in ways they never saw coming. And by the time Alexander's father made his announcement on live television 3 weeks later, Richard would lose his company, his fortune, his mistress, and every shred of dignity he ever had. But here's what will leave you speechless. What did Alexander say to Richard on that street that made a billionaire CEO's face drain of all color? How did Richard's entire empire collapse in just 3 days after one phone call? And what happened when Vanessa realized she'd laughed at the most powerful family in Britain? Did she stay with Richard or abandon him the moment his money disappeared? Stay with me, because the moment Richard sees who just arrived to pick up his poor, pathetic ex-wife, his face transforms from triumph to absolute horror, and it's all caught on camera. Richard was still laughing, still pointing at Emma covered in mud, when he heard the sound of engines, multiple engines, approaching fast. His smile faltered. Vanessa was reapplying her lipstick in the visor mirror, still giggling. "Did you see her face? God, Richard, you're terrible." She looked like a drowned rat. Richard wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were fixed on the 3 black Range Rovers pulling up in perfect formation. Their windows tinted so dark you couldn't see inside, their license plates bearing government seals that made his stomach drop. "Vanessa," he said quietly, "we should go." But it was already too late. The doors of the first Range Rover opened, and 2 men in dark suits stepped out. Not regular security, the kind of security that protects heads of state. They moved with military precision, scanning the street, speaking into earpieces, forming a perimeter around Emma like she was royalty. Then, the back door of the second Range Rover opened. Richard watched, his mouth going dry, as a man stepped out, tall, late 30s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Richard's car payment. Dark hair, strong jaw, the kind of presence that made everyone around him look smaller. The man's eyes immediately found Emma, and something shifted in his face: concern, then horror, then something cold and dangerous that made Richard's hands start sweating on the steering wheel. "Oh my God," Vanessa whispered, her lipstick forgotten. "Richard, is that Alexander Sterling?" Richard said, and his voice sounded strangled. He watched as Alexander Sterling, son of Lawrence Sterling, chief operating officer of Sterling Global Holdings, heir to a 12 billion pound empire, rushed to Emma and wrapped his coat around her shaking shoulders. Watched as Emma looked up at Alexander with tears streaming down her mud-covered face. Watched as she pointed directly at Richard's Bentley. "Richard," Vanessa's voice was rising, panic creeping in. "Richard, that's Alexander Sterling. The Alexander Sterling. Why is he?" "She married him," Richard said, and the words felt like broken glass in his mouth. Emma married Alexander Sterling. The pieces were clicking together in his brain, each one worse than the last. The simple gold band on Emma's finger that he dismissed as cheap, the way she'd been glowing despite being covered in mud, the protective way her hands had gone to her pregnant stomach, not shame, protection, because that baby wasn't just any baby. That baby was the Sterling heir. Richard had just splashed muddy water all over Alexander. Sterling's pregnant wife, the Prime Minister's daughter-in-law, the future mother of the Sterling dynasty, and he'd done it while laughing, while calling her barren, while his mistress cackled in the passenger seat, while a teenager filmed the whole thing on their phone. "Drive," Vanessa said suddenly, her voice sharp with fear. "Richard, drive right now." But Richard couldn't move. He was watching Alexander Sterling's face as Emma told him what happened, watching the way Alexander's jaw clenched, the way his hands curled into fists, the way his entire body went rigid with barely controlled rage. Then Alexander looked directly at the Bentley, directly at Richard, and started walking toward them. "Oh God," Vanessa whispered. "Oh God, Richard, he's coming over here." Richard tried to start the car, but his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't get the key in the ignition. Alexander Sterling was crossing the street now, his security team flanking him, and Richard suddenly understood what it meant to be prey. Alexander reached the Bentley and bent down to Richard's window, his face perfectly calm, perfectly controlled, which somehow made it 1,000 times more terrifying. "Richard Blackwell," Alexander said quietly, and his voice was like ice. "I'm Alexander Sterling. That woman you just covered in mud, that's Emma Sterling, my wife, the mother of my child. And you're gonna pay for every second of what you just did to her." Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His brain was screaming at him to apologize, to explain, to do something, but his voice had completely abandoned him. Vanessa tried to lean across him. "Mr. Sterling, I'm so sorry. We didn't know." Richard said. "She was nobody," he said. "Get out of my sight," Alexander said, not even looking at her, his eyes locked on Richard. "You have 10 seconds to drive away before I have you arrested for assault." Richard finally found his voice. "Alexander, listen. It was just a joke between exes. I didn't know she'd remarried. A joke?" Alexander's eyes were murder. "You mocked her dead baby. You called her barren. You humiliated my pregnant wife on a public street while someone filmed it. Does that sound like a joke to you?" Richard's phone started ringing. He ignored it, but Alexander smiled cold, predatory. "You should answer that." The phone kept ringing. Richard's hands shook as he pulled it out. The screen showed his board chairman's name. "Hello?" Richard's voice cracked. "Richard!" His chairman's voice was panicking, screaming. "Sterling Global Holdings just pulled out. Everything. £340 million in contracts. Gone. They're citing ethics violations and conduct unbecoming." "What did you do?" Richard's face drained of all color. He looked at Alexander, who was still standing there, still watching him with those cold, calculating eyes. "That's just the beginning," Alexander said softly. "By tomorrow morning, you won't have a company. By next week, you won't have a reputation. And by the time my father is done with you, you'll wish you'd shown my wife the respect she deserved." Alexander straightened up, turned around, and walked back to Emma, wrapped his arms around her, helped her into the Range Rover like she was made of glass. The entire convoy drove away, leaving Richard sitting in his Bentley with his chairman screaming in his ear and Vanessa staring at him with dawning horror. "Richard," Vanessa said slowly, "what have we done?"
The video went viral in 17 minutes. The teenager who filmed everything posted it with the caption, "Billionaire CEO splashes mud on pregnant woman," who turns out to be Alexander Sterling's wife. Watch what happens next. By the time Richard got home, it had 10 million views. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. journalists, investors, board members, all demanding answers. Vanessa sat on his couch, scrolling through social media, her face getting paler with every swipe. "Richard, they're calling you a monster. My Instagram is getting flooded with death threats. People are saying I'm just as bad as you." Richard paced his living room, trying to call his PR team, his lawyers, anyone who could make this go away. But every call went the same way: panic, blame, threats to quit. At midnight, his CFO sent an email. "Effective immediately. I'm resigning. I can't be associated with this." By morning, 3 major banks had called emergency meetings. With sterling contracts frozen, Richard's credit lines were at risk. They wanted £60 million. 30 days to pay. "We can liquidate assets," Richard said desperately. "We can—" "Mr. Blackwell," his banker interrupted coldly, "you assaulted a member of the Sterling family on camera. No bank in Britain will touch you." The stock market opened. Blackwell Estates started at £42.50 per share. By noon it was £28.30. By market close, £19.80. A 53% crash in one day. Richard watched his personal fortune evaporate. £22 million gone in 6 hours. His board called an emergency meeting. 12 members sat around the mahogany table, and not one of them would meet his eyes. "Richard," his chairman said, and his voice was funeral quiet. "The board has voted. You're removed as CEO effective immediately. Marcus will take over." "You can't do this!" Richard slammed his fist on the table. "I built this company." "And you destroyed it in one afternoon," his chairman said. "Security will escort you out." Richard sat in his Mayfair flat that night, watching the news coverage. Every channel was running the story. Property developer humiliates Prime Minister's daughter-in-law. They showed the video on loop. Emma standing there pregnant and dripping, Richard laughing, Vanessa cackling. He looked like a villain. He was a villain. Vanessa walked in with 2 suitcases. "Where are you going?" Richard's voice was hollow. "I'm leaving." She wouldn't look at him. "Matthew Thornton called, the hedge fund manager. He wants to take me to dinner." "You're leaving me for someone else?" "Now? I'm leaving you because you're about to lose everything, Richard, and I'm not stupid enough to stay." She grabbed her bags and walked to the door. These 2 years, did they mean nothing? Richard's voice broke. Vanessa finally looked at him. There was nothing in her eyes. No love, no pity, nothing. They meant expensive dinners and a lifestyle I couldn't afford. Alone, but that's over now. The door closed. Richard sat alone in his half-empty flat, realizing he'd destroyed his marriage to Emma for Vanessa, and Vanessa never cared about him at all. 3 weeks later, Richard was living in a 2-bedroom flat in South London. The Mayfair penthouse had been seized by banks, the Bentley repossessed. He worked as a property consultant now, making £65,000 a year, less than Emma made as a teacher. Vanessa's engagement to Matthew Thornton was announced in the Times. She looked radiant in the photo, wearing a diamond that cost more than Richard's annual salary. He saw the Sterling Family Charity Gala announcement on social media, a live broadcast on BBC One, raising funds for children who'd lost parents. Emma's passion project. Richard told himself he wouldn't watch. But at 8 p.m. he turned on the television because he couldn't help himself. The ballroom was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers, 200 of Britain's most powerful people in evening gowns and tuxedos. And there was Emma, standing beside Alexander in an emerald gown that perfectly showed her 6-month pregnancy. She was glowing, radiant, confident, loved. At 8:15, Lawrence Sterling took the microphone. His presence commanded the entire room. "Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. Before we continue, I have joyful news to share." The room went silent. "Many of you know my son Alexander married the love of his life this year. Emma Sterling has brought light and purpose to our family. She's shown us what true strength looks like. Kindness in the face of cruelty, dignity despite disrespect, love after heartbreak. Emma's eyes filled with tears. Alexander squeezed her hand. Tonight, I'm honored to announce that Emma is carrying my first grandchild, the heir to the Sterling family legacy. The room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Richard's hands gripped his cheap sofa. Lawrence's voice grew stronger. This child represents the future of everything we've built. Emma has taught us that true worth isn't about wealth. It's about character. It's about treating every human being with dignity. His eyes seemed to look directly through the camera. Which is why, I want to be clear, anyone who disrespects my family, who would harm my daughter or endanger her child, will face consequences. We protect our own. Everyone in the room knew exactly who he meant. Richard turned off the TV with shaking hands. 3 months later, the headline screamed, "Emma Sterling welcomes healthy baby boy." The photos showed Emma in a hospital bed, exhausted and glowing, holding James Lawrence Sterling. Alexander stood beside her with tears streaming down his face. Lawrence beamed in the corner like he'd been given the world. Richard saw the coverage on the tube heading home from work. A woman across from him was reading to her daughter from a picture book. The little girl pointed at a newspaper photo. "Mummy, is that the nice ladies? From TV?" It was Emma at a school opening, surrounded by children. "Yes, darling, that's Mrs. Sterling. She helps children learn to read." "She's pretty." "She is, and very kind." Richard looked away, stared at his reflection in the dark tunnel window. He saw a man who'd destroyed the only woman who ever truly loved him. A man who'd splashed mud on a queen and called her worthless. A man who'd lost everything because he never understood what mattered. The Bible says in Galatians 6:7, "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." Richard sowed cruelty and reaped destruction. Emma sowed humility and reaped a kingdom. He didn't lose Emma to Alexander Sterling. He lost Emma to himself. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss stories that prove character, not wealth, determines destiny. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share this with someone who needs to remember that how we treat people matters more than what we own. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living well enough that karma handles the rest. God bless you.